My name is Marjorie Sample. I'm going to be presenting today on Intro to Web Concepts, or what is the web developer talking about? Now, small disclaimer, if you are a web developer, this is probably not the session for you. It's kind of meant for people in other fields, whether you're in business design, whatever it might be. This is kind of to give you an introduction so that it's easier to bridge those conversations when you are talking to developers. So if you're like, oh no, I picked the wrong session, you're not going to offend me if you were to walk out. So just wanted to throw that out there so nobody's disappointed. If you would like to access the slides on your device, I have a QR code. Feel free to scan it, and that will pull it up on your phone or tablet. I'll also tweet them out later so you can have access to them as well. So like I said, my name is Marjorie Sample. I am a UX designer. Twitter handle is @MarjorieSample. And if you tweet out anything, please use the hashtag ATO2016. I was in education prior to UX design, and it's probably actually more terrifying presenting in front of 5-year-olds than it is adults, because for those of you with kids, you know that the two most honest groups of people are small children and drunk people. They tell it like it is. So here we are today. And I love UX design. I'm very passionate about it, especially research. So you're probably wondering, what am I going to learn in the next 45 minutes? So quick overview. It's going to be in layman terms, very broad, but talking about clients and servers, programming languages, best design practices, and tools needed to develop your site. So jumping right into clients and servers. When we think about clients and servers within the World Wide Web, you are the client. You're on your computer. Let's say you get on Google. You're trying to look for a new pair of shoes. So when you type that into the search engine, it submits the request to the server, and the server fulfills it, and it sends that data back to you. So it's really amazing how that works back and forth very quickly. So a website is hosted on the server, and you've probably seen a server at some point. It's got all the different cords coming out, and it's hosting that site. So it's large computers connected to the network. So we have client-side and server-side, and this will be helpful for understanding the various programming languages as well. So when we think about client-side, this is often front-end development, and it's what's happening on your computer, what you're seeing. So for example, when you are doing that Google search, what you see on the screen, that's client-side. On the server side, those are the requests being fulfilled by the server. For example, send me those documents. Send me the link for the shoes I searched. So it is processing those requests and sending it back to you. So just to summarize, you make requests, or clients make requests, servers fulfill them, and it's this back and forth exchange of information, and that's essentially how the internet works. When you hear people talk about the cloud is not this wonderful thing up in the sky that stores your documents. It is actually hosted on another server somewhere else. But the beauty of that is that if something happens to your device, whether you get a virus or it crashes or whatever, you can still access your files. So when you hear them talking about, I'm storing it on the cloud, it's being held on another server. Obviously, you need the internet to work because, again, with clients and servers is the exchange of that information. So jumping into programming languages. A programming language is a set of strings. Strings are letters, numbers, and commands that is changed into machine code that the computer can understand. So for example, if I take a trip to Mexico, I'm going to need to learn Spanish so that I can communicate with the people who are there. Just like if I want to communicate with my computer, I needed to be able to speak the language that it speaks. So programming languages, it's enabling you to tell the computer what you want it to do. So on the client side, which is front end, our three main languages are HTML, which is hypertext markup language. This is the structure of your site. CSS, which is cascading style sheets. This is adding that presentation element. You're adding the styling to it. Basically, you're making it look like it's not in 1995. And then JavaScript, you're adding that interactive layer, the bells and whistles, whatnot, of your website. So these three work really well on the client side or front-end development that you might hear it called. So server side is the back end, and it's what happens behind the scenes. You're not necessarily seeing it in front of you on the front end. It's working and making things process through databases and whatnot. So we have PHP, Ruby, Swift, Java, Python, C#, Perl, and more. These are just a couple examples, and I'll tell you some characteristics about each one. So thinking about Ruby, quick show of hands if you have used Twitter or Hulu. Very popular. Okay, pretty much everybody. So Twitter and Hulu are example of Ruby-powered sites, and Ruby's great for building complicated logic on the database side. So it's a really wonderful thing. And then we have Python. Python's great for beginners because it's fewer lines of code, and it's a great way to get things on the market quicker. Some example of Python-powered sites are Google and YouTube. Again, very common, well-used sites. We also have C#. This is one of the earliest back-end languages, and this was developed by Microsoft for the .NET framework. And PHP is a popular server-side language built for the web. It's commonly bundled with SQL, and so they work very well together. Java. Java is a subset of the C language, and its motto is compile once, run everywhere, so that you're not having to constantly refresh the page. Swift, it works for Mac OS and iOS. It's very concise, and it produces software that is lightning fast. So when you think about the iPhone, they use Swift to make that. All right, so a lot of people, they get JavaScript and Java confused. Java is not short for JavaScript. It is two different languages. So JavaScript is primarily client-side. It can be used on the server side, but mostly you're seeing it on the front end. And it's written procedurally. It can be parsed by any browser, which what that means is that the browser can translate and read it. It was created by Netscape. Java, on the other hand, is server-side. It's object-oriented, and it is parsed by JVM, which is Java Virtual Machine, and so it needs that to be able to read it. And this was created by Sun Microsystems. Things that are not languages. Libraries, frameworks, content management systems, or CMS for short, AJAX. And we're going to break that down and talk about it a little bit more in depth. So libraries are a collection of programming shortcuts for a language. So for example, jQuery I would use for JavaScript. Those are the shortcuts I'm going to use. StackPy, that's made for Python. And so those libraries are helping you out. Frameworks are a collection of tools or assets that help you work in the particular language. So a lot of times you might hear people say Ruby on Rails. So Ruby is the language, and Rails is the framework that they're using. Angular, that works with JavaScript, Django with Python. There's a lot of different frameworks out there, and depending on the language that you are working with will depend on the framework that you use. Content management systems. So this, oftentimes you might hear people say CMS. And it's software application or set-related programs that are used to create and manage digital content. So some of the most popular ones, WordPress, Drupal, very well known. These are examples of CMS. We also have AJAX, which AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And basically, you're combining multiple languages so that you do not have to go and refresh the page. So it's a wonderful tool to use. Web standards. So we want to make sure that we're playing by a certain set of rules. It makes the web a wonderful place for everyone. So the first thing we want to think about is we want to have valid HTML, CSS, and JavaScript so that browsers know how to read the page. We also want to meet accessibility standards so that people with disabilities can use the site. For example, if they are visually impaired, we want to make sure that they can see the text. If they are using a screen reader, we want to make sure that there are alt tags in place so that when the picture comes up blank, they know what it's a picture of. We want to make sure we're using closed captioning if we have videos. These are things that are going to help make it accessible so that everybody can use it. And it's not one of those things that, oh, yeah, it's nice to have. It's actually the law. So when you look at Section 508 and some of the others, web accessibility is very important. We want to make sure we include that. We also want to make sure we have valid metadata. So this is information about the page, and this allows search engines to index it. So even when you're thinking about your SEO, you want to make sure that your web page is ranking up high in the search engines, and so you can establish that. You also want to have proper character encoding, so that way special characters don't break the page. All right, so now we're going to talk about building the site and the steps that you need to build a successful site and what that leads to. So the very first thing is when you're building a site, you want to ask yourself these 3 questions. And the first one is, what is the purpose of the site? This is one of the most important things. If you don't have a purpose or a reason for it, it probably doesn't need to be there. And then you want to ask, who are my users? What are their goals? And this might not be something you know right away, but this involves research. You want to research your users and look, what are they trying to accomplish? This is a great place to do the user personas and to find out more about what they're trying to do. What are your business goals? Obviously, businesses want to make more money, but how can you do that? So do you want to increase the number of signups? Do you want to increase the number of people who, when they put things in their cart, they actually then follow through the checkout? So there's a lot of metrics and ways that you can measure that, but you want to establish those goals up front so that you have a plan and a purpose. So looking at these sites, and this goes across a couple pages, but these actually the first 4 steps all kind of fall under the UX umbrella. And so again, you want to research at the beginning. You're finding out your users and business needs, and then you want to define them. So you can create SMART goals. You can create an MVP, a minimum viable product, and you are defining essentially what you want this site or this app to do for you. So if you take the time to do this in the beginning, you save yourself a lot of heartache in the end because you're not having to backtrack and constantly change things. Next, jumping into information architecture, you want to think about your site structure. How do you want to plan out the pages? Great thing to do is a card sorting activity. And so what you do is you write down all the pages you want to have, and then go to your users and say, hey, how would you group this? It's very insightful to see how they categorize things, because how you categorize it in your mind is a lot of times very different from your users. I'll never forget the first card sorting experience I did, and I was shocked at the way people grouped it together. So it's a really good thing to do for your site, especially when you're planning your site structure. You also want to come up with a controlled vocabulary, so you want to make sure that you're being consistent. If you call something this on one page, call it the same thing on the other page. Don't suddenly change it. It's going to confuse your users, because even though you might know what it means, they may not make that connection, and you don't want your users to have to think. You want it to be very easy for them. So once you've established that research and you've put it together, this is where the design part comes into play. And a lot of times you start with wireframes, and you start with simple sketches. I personally like to do thumbnail sketches, which are little tiny squares, and you sketch out as many ideas as you can possibly think of. And then you say, okay, which ones are promising? And then you take those and you create more developed wireframes. And so even at the paper prototype stage, you can start testing it with your users, because there's really no perfect design out there. And so what you want to do is find those mistakes quickly, and then go ahead and revise and make changes, so that way you're not wasting your developers' time when they're having to go back and constantly change things. So once you've built those paper prototypes, you can build them on the web. There's lots of wonderful tools to do that. And then again, you want to test them again. You want to test throughout the design process. It's going to make for a stronger app or website. And then we go into the UI design, which is user interface. This is where we're adding the colors, the fonts, the pictures. We are making that site come to life. And that's an important stage as well. And then we send it to development, and we code it, and we make it come to life. So all of these pieces really work well together to make this site happen. Once the site is built, we send it to QA testing, quality assurance, and we look for bugs. We look for things that are, can we break this? What's going to happen? We want to put it through the testing to make sure it's going to be successful when we launch it. Now, once you launch it, it's not suddenly done forever. You want to make sure you are updating it, that you're making changes, because again, the number one thing, you want to make sure it's working for your users and working for your business. As long as you're meeting those 2 goals, that's great. But you want to make sure that you're continually meeting those goals. So that's building the site. So now we're going to shift and talk about design best practices. So, of course, many of you are aware, mobile first. If I look around the room right now, the majority of you have your cell phones rather than a laptop. It's portable, it's easy. There are a large percentage of the population across the world that rely solely on a mobile device. That means they don't have access to a laptop or desktop, and that's what they use to access the internet. So you want to make sure your site is responsive so that it will work on a mobile device, because otherwise you're losing a huge chunk of your users. You also want to make sure your site is user-centered. Does the user know where to go? Is the navigation simple? There are a lot of statistics out there. The user will spend about 10 seconds on your site. If they don't immediately see what they need or they see the purpose of your site, they're going to leave and go somewhere else, because there's a lot of competition out there, and there are plenty of other sites that they can go to meet their needs. So you want to make sure that you can help them meet it quickly without them having to think. So usability testing, I talked about this a little while ago. You want to make sure the design works for your users. It is never too early to test. Even if it's a paper prototype, test it. See how your users interact with it. You can have it and have them say, hey, show me where you would click to go here. And you can watch how they interact. You want to do this throughout the design process, not just once. So this quote is at the core of my philosophy. It's by Steve Jobs, and it says, design is not just what it looks and feels like. Design is how it works. You can have the most beautiful site out in the world, but if it does not work for your users and your business, then what's the purpose of it? The results. So if you do these things, you're going to have a site that deepens engagement, it increases conversation, it raises satisfaction, and the most important thing, it brings your users back. If you're a business, you want your users to come back. You want them to refer their friends, because ultimately that's going to grow. It's going to make your business more successful. So if you are doing those things, that's going to occur as a result. So now that we've talked about design best practices, we're going to talk about the tools needed to build your site. So the very first thing you're going to need is a text editor. And a text editor is a document that you can edit your code in. Some examples are Atom, Sublime Text, Text Wrangler, Notepad. I personally like Atom. I used Sublime Text for a while, but the pop-ups drove me crazy. So Atom works really well, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. There's a lot of free options. Please don't feel like you have to pay for one. The other thing you want is a web browser. This is going to allow you to test your code and make sure it's working. A lot of times, you might save your code and then go in and say, hey, how's this look? And you want to make sure that it works. So Chrome, Firefox, Safari, those are good to use. Chrome, Firefox, they are open source, and they're wonderful for that. So I'm going to exit real quick and show you what that looks like. So if I was to pull up Atom, so here's an example of some code. And let's say I saved it. I want to go test it in my web browser. So then I'm going to pull up my file. And I'm going to click on it so that way it pops up in my web browser. This was a class I taught a little while ago. And so I can go through and say, hey, you know what? This is working. This is great. But there are two tools in Chrome particularly that work really well. And that's the inspect tool, and you can also view the page source. So if you click on view page source, you can actually go in and you can see all the code on that site. This is particularly fun if you want to go to other people's sites and see how they did it. So that's a nice tool to have. The inspect tool is also helpful. So it'll bring up this box at the bottom, and you can go through and see how different, what the different elements look like and how it's affecting it. This is helpful when you're trying to debug, and maybe, for example, you have a picture and you want it to go all the way to the right side, but it's not. There's a weird gap. So you can go in and see, where the margin's set at. And so it's a good way to establish kind of what's going on. So I use the inspect tool. It's very helpful to find out if something, especially if something is not working. So those are two tools that you can use. And of course, everybody has a web browser. It's on your computer. But that's, you can right-click and get to those fairly easily. You also want, once you have coded your site, you want to host it. If you are building a small personal site, it should not cost you more than $60 a year. There's a lot of good places to host. You can research and see which one is best for you. Your hosting choices may depend on the supported size server tech, so depending on the needs of your site is going to depend on who you host with. You also want to get a domain name. So domain names, again, should not cost you more than $15 a year. Google Domains, GoDaddy, those are some examples. I have my web address. I got it from Google Domains. It was very easy to do. Very simple process. And once you buy it for the year, you've got it for till next year. So your web team, ideally, a business would have all these members on the web team. They might be larger or smaller depending on the size of the company. But on our front end, our client side, we have our web developer, our UX and UI designer, and so they're working as a front-end team to make that happen. On the back end, we have our web developer, software engineer, server admin, database admin. You might also hear the term full stack. So a full stack engineer has both front-end and back-end skills. So that's a wonderful thing because they're going to be able to accomplish a lot. How to hire a developer. You want to think of the 3 R's. So references, requirements, and reality. With the references, talk to people that have worked with them. Were they prompt? Were they pleasant? Did they do what they said they were going to do? Were they reliable? Kind of get a sense of who they are. Requirements, can they do the work? Look at their portfolio. Look at their GitHub files. See what have they done in the past, and is it going to work for the job you want them to complete? Reality, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. You might have heard of the term unicorn. So especially, like I know in UX field, we talk about unicorns, and they're like these magical creatures that can do all these wonderful skills. And so the thing about that is, you know, if you're trying to do everything, a lot of times you get burnt out, or you don't do those things well. So it's almost better to specialize in certain areas so you can do a more efficient job. But ultimately, you want to hire somebody that you feel is going to be invested and that they're going to be able to get the job done. On the flip side, if you are a developer and you want to be hired, a couple things to keep in mind: degrees and certifications. They don't hurt. They're definitely going to help you. Build things even if you're not getting paid. You want to build up your portfolio. Definitely, you know, pick up some work pro bono. It's going to help you expand. And be curious and be a problem solver. Don't be afraid to test things out. Try that code. You know what? If you break it, oh well, you were testing it out anyway. So it's better to be curious and not be afraid to fail, because ultimately that's going to help you grow. And the most important thing is network and put yourself out there. There are so many groups, especially if you're in the Raleigh-Durham area, through Meetup and other things that you can find, and you can network with people, and that's going to help you. It's like the saying, it's not what you know, but who you know. And so by taking that time to network, that's really going to help you. And so that wraps it up. I hope you learned something new. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. You can either raise your hand now, or you can come up and ask individually if you don't want to ask it to the whole group. Yes?
What's the difference between the UX developer and the UI developer?
Great question. So UX, it stands for user experience, and that person is doing a lot of the research, and they are doing your information architecture, your wireframes. The UI designer, which stands for user interface, they're doing more of the aesthetics, and they're planning out your colors, your fonts, the pictures, the element, like how the site looks. Yeah, great question. Yes?
What would you say, like, the best way of, you know, having a site look both good on, like, a phone and a computer without having to maintain, like, separate code bases?
Excellent question. So responsive design is the best thing you can do. And with responsive design, you can put in page breaks. And so when you put in those page breaks, what happens is, for example, I'll use Girl Develop It as an example. So if I go and I look at the chapters, right now I have 3 across the page. But if I make my screen smaller, notice how they get smaller so that I'm not having to scroll side to side. But if I get too small, what happens? Notice how it changed. Now it lists the cities. So on a cell phone, it's going to look more like this. It's going to have them listed than with the pictures. So you can put in those page breaks so that it adjusts to the size. At the same time, if somebody has a very large screen, it's going to adapt naturally, and then you're not having to create separate code. So just research responsive web design, and that's got a lot of great resources on there. Any other questions? Yes? I personally don't, because I am in UX design, but I've heard a lot of wonderful things about it.
It's like the way when you scroll resized, it moved to that list. I didn't know how you did that.
My friend actually coded this site, so I'll have to ask her. So she created it. Any other questions? Yes?
Three developers, web developers, UI and UX developers. Which developers has a highly demand?
Say that one more time.
Three developers you have. Which developer is the more highly demanded in the market?
Well, it's you're going to need your web developer for sure because they're coding and making it happen. UX is one of those things that within the past 5 years has really grown, and businesses are starting to have more of a high demand because they realize that it's going to help generate more revenue for them and help meet the business and user goals. So it's one of those things that's growing more rapidly as time goes on because people are seeing the importance of it. But definitely, I mean, all three are very important, but you've got to have your developer because otherwise it's not going to exist. So I guess if I had to say which one is the most important, I would pick that. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Similar question to what I had before, but having different browsers out there, what's the best way to maintain or like make sure that it'll work?
Yes. So that's an excellent question. And again, the responsive web design. So when you're putting in those breakpoints, with the different browsers, it will adapt to that browser. There is a website, and I'm trying to think of what it is off the top of my head, but it will show you what like certain browsers support. Like for example, Internet Explorer does not support a lot of things. I'm trying not to like give my opinion on Internet Explorer, but y'all know it's horrible. But anyway, it doesn't always support things. So you can do, like kind of progressive enhancement and, add things to your site that other browsers can handle, but then the person who still uses Internet Explorer, they can still have a wonderful experience too. So again, that responsive web design is going to help with that. Yes?
Instead of writing code for a website, is there any tools you know of that are those better ones that you can drag and drop placement?
Okay, so that's like the what you see is what you get. There are tools out there that will help you. Off the top of my head, like Wix, Squarespace. I think GoDaddy does have some drag and drop feature. No, I haven't played with GoDaddy, so okay. Yeah. Oh, my mind's blank right now. But yeah, check out Wix. That's a good one. I recommend that to a lot of people who don't code but want to be able to drag and drop and make a beautiful looking website. And they have a lot of good templates too. Yeah. Any other questions? I hadn't even looked at the time. Oh, I spoke really fast. I apologize. When I practiced this the other day, I like spread it out to 42 minutes, and then I think being in a room full of people, I suddenly spoke a million miles a minute. So the great news is y'all have some extra time that you can go around to the booths and do other things. So are any other questions before we wrap up? Yes?
So the Bootstrap framework was mentioned. Do you have any preferred frameworks?
I personally don't, just because with UX design, I don't do a ton of coding. If I do, it's primarily HTML, CSS. Beyond that, I break stuff. It's not pretty. So my experience is with UX design. So I'm not the best person to ask that question, but I'm sure there are plenty of other people at this conference who can give you wonderful suggestions on that. See another hand?
So when you start designing a website, do you actually take a piece of paper, just draw it in there, and just visually stuff you want it to go, and then translate it into a website?
Yes. So the first thing, like when I was talking about thumbnails, I have little squares, and I just print out a bunch of squares on a paper, and then I just sketch out my designs. But you can pull out a sheet of paper and sketch ideas. It does not have to be anything fancy. Now, like the nerdy version of me, I have like the iPad paper, and it's really cool because it has like iPhones and iPads printed on it, and I can actually sketch on that, and it already has that like border on there. So that's kind of a fun tool. You can Google it, like you can just put in like UX sketch pads, and there's plenty of them out there. But from that, once you do paper, there's a lot of wireframing tools. So I personally like UX Pen is a really good one. Sketch is good. Of course, Illustrator, Photoshop, those are great tools too. And then for prototyping, I like InVision because it's very easy to import your wireframes, and then you can create hotspots. So then it acts like a normal app or website, and you can test it before actually having to code it. So those are some great tools to check out. Anybody else? Yes? Oh my goodness. There are things that, will kind of stay the same, but it changes a lot. I was working on a project recently, and I think about how many times the dashboard changed. And what I initially thought would work for the users is not what worked. And so it went through a lot of testing. It went through a lot of changes. But that's the beauty of testing throughout the process, is you don't go through the whole process and code it and then find out, oh, man, this doesn't work. So yes, it will change, because like I said, there's no perfect design out there. And it's better to find those mistakes as quickly as possible, and that's why I recommend testing as early as possible. Because you can never assume that what works for you will work for your users. You've got to get it out there and test it with them and see. And it's kind of scary / amazing to see how users will interact with your site, especially when you've designed it and you've worked on it for weeks and weeks, and then you watch them do really random, scary things. So it's an eye-opener to see how the user thinks. But it's important, because ultimately that's going to create a more well-adapted site for the user. Any other questions? All right, wonderful. Thank you guys so much. I hope you learned something new, and enjoy the rest of the conference.